Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next session of the ITSS Verona Member Series podcast. We're very happy to have you here for our session focused on human security, this time from the perspective of migration policy and asylum. We have a wonderful guest speaker today, which I'm very, very excited to introduce as a scholar in the field, a practitioner, and a mentor of mine, Anisa Abeytia. We are going to tell you a little bit about her background before hearing from her and the groundbreaking research that she is doing both in academia and on the ground. So Anisa is a migration researcher and policy professional specializing in digital bordering, active social inclusion, and colonial antecedents and integration policy. She's worked with the United States Congress, the Department of Homeland Security, and the US State Department to shape US Syria policy, as well as published with the University of Cambridge, UNESCO, and the Hill, among many others. She is the Global Research Network's think tank program coordinator and the digital inclusion coordinator at the International Rescue Committee. And this is just a short list of the many engagements and achievements that she has. So I will pass the floor on to her for her to tell us a bit more about the wonderful work she's doing.
Well, thank you, Esther, for that introduction. And thank you. You are actually the first person who has ever pronounced my full name correctly.
Oh my.
So I was like, oh, yes, that is my name. So, what I can bring to this conversation is interlocking three aspects of this topic together: is the border security with how it's viewed in integration programs, particularly in Europe, and with humanitarian responses.
That's brilliant and extremely necessary right now with the state of affairs we see in the world and the continuous avenues of displacement and migration, and how there's not enough of a human security focus in our responses to that. So I have a few questions that I'd really like to go through just to get a bit more of your expertise in this line. So I know that your work has been groundbreaking in tracing colonial vestiges on migration and asylum policy. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about the ways in which these colonial structures continue to differentially define the human security status of refugees.
Mm-hmm. Well, my first graduate studies focused on post-colonial thought and feminist theory. And that approach typically is thought of as an approach for the humanities and literature. And that's something that's readily used as a lens in the social sciences. So when I eventually migrated over to the social sciences, I was quite surprised to find that colonialism in general and post-colonialism was not at all something that was being considered as a motivation, as a driver, or as a bias when particularly constructing policies that impact people that are from the global south, who are typically the countries that experience colonialism. And so when I began work in US Syria policy, although the thing is, what's difficult to kind of pinpoint for the social sciences in addressing this, and Julian Go in his book Post-Colonial Thought and Social Theory starts to tease out these ideas of how can we bring post-colonial thought, or what he calls kind of these relationships. How can we start tracing them to how social sciences are being, again, used to propagate preferential treatment for certain groups? Now, one has to first look back at how and why the social sciences, particularly anthropology, was developed, and was really developed in service of colonialism and in drafting policies that placed colonized populations at a disadvantage, saying that, from a societal perspective, they were not as developed as European or European descended colonies like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States. So that's one way to start discussing and looking at it. And so when I was working in Syria U.S. policy, it's not that any of these things can be directly linked. It's not like Jim Crow. It's not like yellow laws that prevented non-whites, particularly Chinese and Asian immigrants from entering the United States. They're more echoes of behaviors that we see creeping up. People are more familiar with the term microaggressions. This is more similar to microaggressions. They're not easily seen. People typically don't verbalize them in an aggressive way. The most aggressive way that we see right now is, backlash in nationalist movements that talk about the destruction of white society and making America great again, making America white again. So these policies stem from popular opinion. And that's where it gets very, very fuzzy, where you have ideas that society hold about other groups of people. And even a marginalized group of people can have a post-colonial idea of another marginalized group. And it creates this cycle of undermining and undervaluing different populations. And, we just see the Syria, or what happened in Syria and Turkey. The response, again, Syria isn't receiving the same type of aid and assistance because of the way humanitarian aid is delivered in the region. But to go back, how we can recognize these in policy, and where do these structures lie? One, in border security, the way borders are policed in the global north. Typically, people from the global south are not welcomed. They are exposed to a multi-layered system of asylum and integration. And the approach to, Ukraine versus Afghanistan or Syria are clear examples of this. Another thing that a colleague of I, Jasmine Diab wrote about for the UN was how historic trauma is also weaponized at the border, where families share their experience with colonialism and how devastating it was to their communities and how they were brutalized. And when the Haitian community was trapped on the Mexico side of the border, when they started to come over in Texas, you had images of white men on horseback attacking Black bodies at the border. I mean, this was just a very visceral representation of that slavery, oppression, and then also brown children in cages. We wouldn't do this to white population, and we did it. The U.S. opened the border 24 hours for the Ukrainians refugees, and as we should have. Offices were opened in Poland and throughout Europe to accommodate the the mass exodus of Ukrainians, as we should have. So there's this double, triple policy of how we police our borders. We have the whole idea of there's different types of migrants, there's different types of ways to seek asylum, and it really goes to the operational language. It's very difficult to include, ultimately, the language of asylum needs to be updated to reflect the current situation that we're in and to accommodate for mass exodus due to situations colonialism created. Africa, case in point. If there is a low man on the totem pole for migration, it is any migrant coming from Africa. They're seen as economic migrants. But why were they placed in this position of, it's still a very wealthy continent, very resource rich, but because their resources are being extracted to the global north because of international law, international finance policy, loan and interest payments. So it goes to this complex of this region is their resources are still being extracted, whether it's the legal means of IMF or any other institutionalized extraction of African, Latin American, Asian resources, coupled with the luring away of workers. One of the things that happened during slavery was the first huge brain drain, where African technology, knowledge of how to farm, how to build, how to create, was extracted to the global north. And that's what propped up the wealth of the global north. And now because countries in the global south don't have access to good education, good healthcare, and for multiple reasons that the citizenry did not have adequate means to change, because they're being held in poverty, because it serves the global north, and it's something that nobody wants to acknowledge, because once you say post-colonial antecedents, reparations follow, and nobody wants to pay reparations. So you have Europe knows they need migrants. The United States knows they need migrants. Canada knows they need migrants. Australia, because we are not meeting the native populations currently living there are not meeting the replacement number of people. These are countries that are social democracies that require a tax base. So if people aren't reproducing at a rate to replace workers as they retire, the social structure falls apart. So they do need low-wage workers. And that basically what we're doing, and I see it as an expansion of colonialism, because this is now circling back to the global north, where we're putting our own populations in financially precarious situations where there's no work security, workers don't have rights, unions are being busted, workers don't have any type of security, income isn't getting isn't keeping pace with inflation. So all of these, and this all goes to a financial system. It's not so much as human rights or per se just strict racism. It goes to bolstering an elite society where human rights aren't the primary goal. If And you see this, I focus now on digital, on the digital world, on teaching and lessening the digital divide, bridging that gap. And one of the conversations that I was invited to a panel for a conference next week is talking about digital security. Now we have a lot of inequities in the real world, and most of them are based on identity, marginalized groups. But now you see ever increasing amounts of disparities between economic classes. You can have privacy, you can have security online if you can afford it. It doesn't matter what color you are. But yes, these types of historically marginalized populations still bear the brunt of being on the opposite side of the digital world. So now we have two worlds, online world and the physical world. And that's when I talk about physical and digital bordering, and why I became very involved in digital bordering, where you have there's a lot of hope. A lot of hope was around being able to use the internet to compensate for these gaps, but instead we got echo chambers. So how do you break that up? How do you make the online world more accessible so people can have an active say in their existence? So that's it's kind of a roundabout way of answering the question, because it's not easily identified. But they are things that the EU themselves have acknowledged that particularly Islamophobia and anti-Semitism play a lot into reactions of society, and then those reactions then impact our policymakers. And I think that the one takeaway, we have to be able to identify and acknowledge that public sentiment directly impacts the way we draft policy, the way we implement policy. And until we acknowledge that as policymakers, we have a bias. We're human beings. It's not, we're not a blank slate. We come with a very come with our own backgrounds. And it's very important to acknowledge that. And now there's ways to work around that. And I know you have some questions that work around that ask that, so I will continue on with that.
But thank you so much. To me, that's a brilliant response, because you're going into, these are the historical and systemic effects. This is how they play out. This is how, this transfer into, or this development of the digital world feeds into, that was supposed to sort of act as an equalizer in many facets, has in a way also played a role in substantiating inequality in many ways. So how are we reacting to that? And the fact of bias in policymaking, I think, is incredibly significant, because it's this unacknowledged trend where policy establishes or attempts to establish itself as neutral regardless of the human impacts it has, and how that blinds us to our understandings of differential impacts. But precisely in that line, you've talked about formalized policy approaches, and then you've also talked about public sentiment, which I think is a huge thing. There are informal processes through which differential targeting is applied. And I was hoping, I know you've done research in this, I was hoping to ask you a little bit more if you could tell me about these informal processes, because they're rarely really spoken about either in policy or in academia.
Yeah, and I think it goes to who gets to engage in policy. There's really only two social science disciplines who are engaged and invited: economists political scientists. Now, economics believes people behave rationally. That's an erroneous supposition to begin with. The other big group that deals with policy are lawyers. Now, when you're creating when let's use technology terms. When you have an end user who is a human, you need to bring in tools and resources that help you understand the individual and the community. You ask questions in a different way when you're an anthropologist, a sociologist, than if you were an economist or a political scientist or an attorney. It's different ways of looking at the problem, different ways of framing the questions, different ways of viewing the context. So many times policymakers need quick and easy fixes. Now, if there was a quick and easy fix to a human problem, that would be wonderful. But the challenge in democracy is that we want to have one participation, representation, so that we're serving the greatest number of people. You cannot do that in the current system that we have because it does not invite multiple voices. The issue is that it doesn't start from a community base. There's not an understanding of what the community needs, nor is there an acknowledgement that the community itself has knowledge that's useful. So that's kind of what the Global Research Network, what we focus on and what we want to contribute to the field of policymaking is looking at local populations as sources of information. Another group of people who aren't invited are researchers. You know, the EU is well known for funding so much research, but then not listening or acknowledging the findings of the research that they're funding. So, and there's a great, I don't remember where it's at, but a collaboration where you have anthropologists, sociologists, and lawyers coming together to figure out how do you meld the two together in order to create functional policy. Now, when I was working in the field of policy very actively, the first thing I would do was go to the community that this policy would impact. That sometimes involved foreign travel, sometimes it involved, going up and down the state of California. It's very labor intensive. And this is the number one reason why it's not the fast, easy tool. Because it's not fast and easy. It's very nuanced. And I just handed in the first policy brief that I've written that's nuanced, that's directed at trying to look at a very important policy indicator from multiple levels. And it's taken a long time, like a year, because of many factors, and trying to figure out how can we make this a tool that's good and usable. There's a lot of times researchers will come, and that was the first issue we faced, is they said it read too much like a research brief. Because you want to bring the research, but how do you bring the research without bringing the research? And how do you frame it in a way that's relevant to a policymaker who has to make a decision? How much funding is going to be used? How is this going to be implemented in programming? And that's why I'm very interested in how do you create a functioning program rooted in research and applicable to policy.
And that's the fundamental goal, right? The fundamental question, and what you were talking about, bringing the knowledge and insight from research in such a concrete way that policymakers will be able to effectively translate that into measures with a community focus, with a delineated community impact. It's such a labor-intensive and delicate and nuanced process that so many times what comes to influence policy is lacking in every single one of these aspects because the work behind it, yeah.
And it really comes to one, whose knowledge is valid.
Right.
Whose knowledge is seen as knowledge, whose knowledge is seen as like folklore.
Right.
Or anecdotal.
Right. And that's defined along colonial patterns.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Usually communities, women, marginalized groups, children, their voices aren't seen as authoritative as someone who's coming from a background where they're going to give you just quantitative data. I'm a very strong believer in this method approach because both approach, just a purely quantitative or a purely qualitative approach, isn't going to give you a good picture because you need to be able to understand what are the different factors that maybe a percentage might not be able to show you. Like right now, we're getting ready to do a study on how our workforce curriculum is functioning for 3 different populations. Now, it may be something outside of our curriculum completely that's impacting our clients' ability or inability to make digital skill gains. And then you go in and you decide, okay, what are the indicators we want to measure? And the other thing that becomes very tricky is sometimes there's things you want to measure that are difficult to measure. Like yesterday, we had our big kickoff meeting, and one of the things we want to measure is how much are we encouraging the clients to learn. Another one is how well are we assisting, targeting marginalized groups within the refugee population. So that these are kind of things like, well, how would you measure that? How do you give a good measurement of that? So I brought in someone who's an applied mathematician, so he'd be able to help us measure these things. And so I mean, there's ways to do it, but because they're not the standard, like a lot of times we get locked into this is the way we've always done it, so this is the way we're going to continue to do it. But these ways aren't working. They didn't function well before. Now, when we have more and more, diverse population, diverse needs, we need to be more creative, more agile than we were before. And that's why I really like to use modular frameworks, where you can produce something that's a structure, but then someone can take this part and use this, and someone can take this part and use this, and kind of like a Lego approach to building programs and because ultimately that's what you want to do. You want to create programs that work. You want to work through policies that work.
I love that, a Lego approach to programming. I love that. And you're maximizing utility, you're maximizing reach, you're allowing it to be transformed to different, to better serve different target populations or you're leveraging that flexibility while maintaining sort of the process that works. So I think that's incredibly useful.
Community-based approach, which I know you've written extensively on, where there's these post-colonial antecedents. They impact communities around the world, regardless if they're in the global south or not, because these are now policy approaches that have been institutionalized everywhere. Like this, even in the U.S., We don't have universal health care. We don't have worker rights, really. So this is one way that allows for that. It's building new policy tools.
Right. And thank you so much, because that brings me to my last question, and I think it's so interesting. We've talked about the construction of these policies. We've talked about the way that these policies hold differential impacts, and a little bit of the work that can be done to better develop alternative solutions. But what do you think are, and I know this is a very difficult question, what do you think are the next steps that we should be taking, specifically in migration and asylum policy, to ensure a more human security-based approach to sort of start deconstructing these colonial antecedents that we see have such a tremendous impact on how we address migration currently?
The first step to anything is having a conversation. Really, and really hats off to the UN, one of the UN universities. They had can't remember when it was exactly, but within the last month, a conversation about how biases impact migration, and particularly how biases within communities impact refugees' ability to integrate. And it's something that I've been writing about for a long time, and other people have. But allowing for these types of conversations to happen at that type of level is very valuable. Allowing, having calls for there to be discussions, and people are writing about this, but they're not being published. Another thing is it's also our responsibility as researchers, particularly if you're receiving public funds, to make your research accessible. I was at a conference one time in Germany, and after the presentation, I said, "Okay, well, that was great, but this is what we just present is there's like 4 people that it's important to. At tops, your advisor, you, and your mom." Because other than that, really your research doesn't go anywhere else. It's like you take years to produce research. You go to a conference, you present it, it's written up in an academic journal, and then it's put on the shelf. Because no policymaker, no community member is ever going to have access to that. Also, there's paywalls for most academic journals. So like one of the things that I do is I write op-eds, particularly for a couple of UK-based online publications. So we need to become more comfortable with writing in different styles. I even write short stories to illustrate kind of how these policies are impacting people in a very real way. Art isn't, there's a lot of people that are doing this, but it's just a matter of finding where you reach a critical mass. And that's what really the focal point of the Global Research Network is providing a mechanism for scholars from around the world who recognize what's happening in the world, and that it all has to do with the way society was structured 500 years ago. It was of extraction, exploitation. But as a species, we have the opportunity to now move away from that. Just because we always, for the last 500 years, focused on exploitative forms of capitalism, doesn't mean that that's the end all. During the Middle Ages, nobody could see beyond feudalism. There couldn't possibly be an economic or social system different than feudalism. But because of the multiple waves of bubonic plague, it wiped out most of the workforce, wiped out most of the aristocracy, that the workers were then able to command more pay, more rights, more, and their needs had to be met. There had to be. So at that time, it was never thought that something beyond feudalism could have existed. So now we have to think and imagine new ways. Instead of sending our best and brightest minds to Wall Street, we need to fund think tanks, innovative thought. I mean, we're not even funding a way to get us out of the global disaster that's heading our way. That every single scientist worth their brain has been predicting since the 70s. And it's because it requires a change in our thought, a change in our values. We value the bottom line, profit. That means we have to enslave people from Africa. That means we got to put kids in cages. That's what it's going to take. And it's the structure we put in place. Colonialism is very much a patriarchal, hierarchical form of a social system. Is that the social system we still want? And we see those echoes throughout our laws. Our laws are not about justice. They're about holding in place the power that certain populations have. Because regardless you're in India, if you're poor, you're poor. There's elite in India. There's elites in Africa. They're benefiting, and they have historically benefited from this type of social structure. So in the end, how post-colonial antecedents impact policy it's reinforcing the social structures we have now. So now we have to identify what social structures exist. Our policies are racist because they're designed to be inequitable.
And what a statement, right? I think you've just worded it beautifully and so impactfully. And I really like the points you brought up about this is a moment in which our brightest minds should be critically thinking about what are the transition points and values in our systemic structures and translating that into policy decision making that will better serve populations that right now fall under the weight of the oppression of these sort of self-reinforcing systems. Thank you so much. This has been an incredibly interesting conversation, and we will make sure to redirect to your work, which extensively covers these kinds of issues and which is so policy oriented and which has, again, been shaping the conversation at the UN level, at government level. And it is just a pleasure to speak to you and to listen to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're more than welcome, Danielle. And this is what you would call a fourth wave. The fourth wave of post-colonialism was, identifying it, calling it out, shaping it. Now, how to be impactful.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful conversation that I hope we can continue in the future as part of this fourth wave. And we will be redirecting to your work for our viewers to be able to get further an understanding into these vital changes that we're seeing in the conversation, these vital changes that we hope to see in policy, and the work, the research that you're talking about that is out there, that is being done, and that the last stage for it at this moment is for it to be heard and applied. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation.